In a word salad-filled, fantastical ruling, the majority of justices in the Supreme Court, June 21st, determined that it's perfectly consistent with their make-believe view of the Constitution for any level of government to prohibit a free individual from possessing a gun, despite that person not being in jail, not having had due process, and despite that person possessing a natural right to carry and use a firearm, a right that supposedly is explicitly protected by the Second Amendment. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and here's the story. Amy Howe reports for SCOTUS blog. Quote, the Supreme Court on Friday upheld a federal law that bars anyone subject to a domestic violence restraining order from possessing a gun. By a vote of 8-1, the court ruled that the law does not violate the Constitution's Second Amendment, which protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Nice of her to only use that portion of it. The ruling in the United States v. Rahimi was the court's first Second Amendment case since it threw out New York's handgun licensing scheme nearly 2 years ago. In that case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the majority emphasized that courts should uphold gun restrictions only when there is a tradition of such regulation in U.S. history. Here are background details of the case, but I want to note that this specific case is being utilized to facilitate the Supreme Court majority's abstract misreading of the Bill of Rights. And as inflammatory as the details of this particular case might appear, the man in question was not convicted of a crime, nor was he ever given due process prior to the restraining order placed on him that lies as the proverbial trigger for the gun ban. Writes Howe, quote, the challenge to the law came from a Texas man, Zaki Rahimi. In 2020, a court in Texas entered a civil protective order against him after Rahimi dragged his then-girlfriend back to his car when she tried to leave after an argument. He pushed her into the car, causing her to hit her head on the dashboard. Rahimi also fired a gun at a bystander who witnessed the incident. The protective order specifically barred Rahimi from having a gun. Like so-called red flag laws, to which the new court ruling clearly offers a knowing nod or wink of permissibility, in the case of the Rahimi order, the government breached nearly half of the Bill of Rights. Texas didn't give him due process, which is required by the Fifth Amendment. Texas did not give him a speedy and public trial before an impartial jury with a chance to call witnesses, as is required by the Sixth Amendment. Texas followed the toweringly anti-constitutional provisions of the November 1988 federal add-on to the 1968 Gun Control Act, known as the so-called Undetectable Firearms Act, which contained in it what is called U.S. Code Title 18, subsection 922G8, claiming the power to seize Rahimi's gun or punish him for having one, which is both property seizure without just compensation, prohibited by the Fifth Amendment, and is cruel and unusual punishment, prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. He was given no trial because this act of criminal malfeasance by the government of Texas, under the auspices of the aforementioned subsection 922G8 code, passed in 1988, was conducted under the guise of so-called civil procedure. It's been a handy way for governments on every level of the United States to skirt the Bill of Rights and engage in things like civil asset forfeiture, to take the property of drug users or dealers and keep it, rather than involve the actual rights that are supposed to be afforded under normal criminal proceedings, as the founders envisioned everything. Pretty nifty, isn't it? And get this, in backing up their absurd avoidance of the Bill of Rights, the majority on the bench this time did two more insulting things. First, they utilized what I've been trying to warn people was coming ever since former Justice Antonin Scalia dealt away the very notion of rights with his majority opinion in the 2008 D.C. v. Heller case. At the end of the decision, Scalia added the phrase, "rights are not unlimited," which completely undercuts the very meaning of rights. Rights are supposed to be untouchable by government. That's the point. We can freely adjust how much we want to exercise our rights among other voluntary associative people. But the state, that involuntary agency of force, cannot breach our rights. Scalia's one line in Heller destroyed the very meaning of the term, claiming an opening for political forces and future courts to invade our rights. And on page 2 of this new ruling, in just the syllabus of this ruling, and throughout his majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts referred to Heller, indicating that, well, heck, Antonin Scalia said we can attack rights. So yeah, it's totally cool to overlook the concept and also the strict wording of the Second Amendment, which concludes with "shall not be infringed." Yeah, I know, it's really surprising, isn't it? Also not surprising was the fact that the majority both utilized the so-called two-tier standard of the 2022 SCOTUS decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. What the court did then was they created a two-tier analysis of statutes to see whether or not they infringe on the right to keep and bear arms as protected by the Second Amendment. It should be fairly simple, but they created two tiers of analysis. The first tier is whether or not the statute actually conforms with the wording of the Second Amendment, which is essentially a question of asking, does this statute adhere to the wording by infringing or not infringing on the right to keep and bear arms? If it infringes, well, then it doesn't adhere. It's pretty simple. But then the Supreme Court added a second level of analysis, and that second level is, well, if you can supply us with a historical example of someone grabbing a gun that was at the time maybe accepted by people close to the constitutional era, well, then we'll accept that if it's analogous to the contemporary gun grab. It's absurd because it undercuts the first stage of the Bruin analysis. Roberts, Kavanaugh, Brown Jackson, Barrett, Sotomayor, Kagan, Alito, and Gorsuch all agreed to various levels that such an absurd bipolar position on the right to keep and bear arms is perfectly fine, and that such an overtly obvious attack on the other amendments noted earlier in this video also is acceptable. In Amy Howe's report and in the Roberts text, we also discovered that Roberts included not just references to British bans on firearms in the 17th and 18th centuries as excuses for contemporary gun grabs like this, but also that Roberts claimed that at the time of the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the musket was the most powerful privately owned weapon. Well, as I've noted for MRC-TV, and someone might want to mention to that High Lord Roberts, Paul Revere and his son made cannons for people, and the founders never put a technology prohibition clause on the right to keep and bear arms. The majority decision here is an absolute mess, and it is utterly inimical to both the Bill of Rights and the deeper eternal natural rights that we possess, regardless of whether they're written down in the Bill of Rights or not. And the only dissenter here was Clarence Thomas, whose words were stark and blunt and end with this, quote, "Thus, the question before us is not whether Rahimi and others like him can be disarmed, consistent with the Second Amendment. Instead, the question is whether the government can strip the Second Amendment right of anyone subject to a protective order, even if he has never been accused or convicted of a crime. It cannot. The court and government do not point to a single historical law revoking a citizen's Second Amendment right based on possible interpersonal violence. The government has not borne its burden to prove that subsection 922G8 is consistent with the Second Amendment's texts and historical understanding. The framers and ratifying public understood that the right to keep and bear arms was essential to the preservation of liberty. Yet, in the interest of ensuring the government can regulate one subset of society, today's decision puts at risk the Second Amendment rights of many more. I respectfully dissent. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please spread the word about this. I don't think it's going to get a lot of attention. And, of course, find us over at Rumble, where they don't censor us, especially on issues like this. You can still find us on YouTube, where they do censor people. And, of course, when you're there, please double check that you're subscribed, because oftentimes people somehow magically get dropped from their subscriptions at YouTube. You can find us all the time at MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org. While you're there, please consider donating to the Media Research Center. And, of course, check out the MRC-TV store for great items. Find us on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram. And, of course, you can find us on X at any time. If you want to find me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith. And on X, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. Thanks for watching. Please share this video far and wide. For MRC-TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.